Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society Digital Programming. I'm Angela Beaumont, the Director of Operations at the Jefferson. Joining me in conversation is Jeff Sherry, educator at the Hagen History Center in Erie. He is an avid historian with a lifelong interest in history, with particular focus on tragic assassinations of presidents. A retired social studies teacher with over 20 years in the classroom, Jeff Sherry earned a bachelor's and master's degree from Edinburgh University in history. He also has a secondary teacher certification in social studies. Jeff has written several articles and manuals on a variety of historic topics and has spoken to numerous civil and school groups about history. A former reenactor and living historian, he helped found the ship's company, U.S. Brig Niagara, the official living history group of the Brig Niagara. He has also been active in reenacting both World War II and the Civil War. Passionate about baseball, Jeff has coached Little League and Junior American Legion team and coached his son. He enjoys reading and visiting historic sites and museums. And of course, he's no stranger to the Jefferson stage as he presented on the assassination of John F. Kennedy 56 years later through the eyes of the Kennedy detailed United States Secret Service, a fascinating topic with a new angle that I enjoyed immensely. If you have a question or comment, just leave it in the Facebook page comment section or feel free to send us questions and we'll get them along to Jeff as best as we can. And for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, visit www.jeserie.org and like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Jeff, thank you for joining me in this discussion.
Thank you for having me.
Let's turn our attention to the Lincoln assassination, an American tragedy. On April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, was assassinated while watching a play in Washington, D.C. Most Americans know that about the assassination, but few know of the extensive plot involved of the assassination's 12 days on the run. This talk looks at the murder of the president in detail. So Jeff, during my first visit to Washington, D.C. as a young person, my soon-to-be husband and I passed by the Ford Theater, and he pointed out that this is where President Lincoln was shot as he watched the play. I was surprised to hear that the murder happened just 6 days after Lincoln had won the Civil War and freed the slaves. We are eager to learn from you how this tragedy in turbulent times came about.
Well, Angela, I think that Lincoln's death so close to the end of the war is one of the things that makes it so tragic. The man had suffered personally, emotionally, mentally, politically throughout the war. And here he is at his moment of triumph, and he is struck down by an assassin. So let's take a look at the assassination itself. As you said, I think everybody knows Lincoln was shot in the theater, but there's a lot more to this story. Abraham Lincoln, here in the photograph on the left, is shown giving his second inaugural address, may very well have been his best speech. This is the "with malice toward none" speech that Lincoln talks about bringing the North and the South back together. Interesting, in I believe 1960s or 70s, historians at the National Archives or Smithsonian noticed that standing on the balcony above Lincoln was John Wilkes Booth. And below him in the crowd, which you can't see in this photograph, at least two other conspirators are also identified as being right there. Booth wrote in his diary, he was so close to Lincoln, he could have killed him that day. So this has been going on for some time to come. This is one of a later photograph of Lincoln, and you can see the stress and the strain that the Civil War has brought to the man, let alone having lost a son in the White House, Willie, in 1862. And here is the assassin, John Wilkes Booth. Booth, the son of Junius Brutus Booth, the brother of Edwin Booth, both prominent actors, very famous. And I would like to compare Booth, usually compare Booth to a movie star today, not an actor so much as a movie star. His physical portrayals, his antics on stage. Booth was actually in a mock sword fight during a play. He was cut on the head and bled and continued on with the play as though nothing had happened. He was very physical, considered the handsomest man in America, one of the men who had more pictures taken of him probably than anyone at the time other than Abraham Lincoln, and a vain man, born in Bel Air, Maryland, which is near the Pennsylvania line, northwest of Baltimore. Booth considered himself a Southerner. Marylanders were a divided bunch. Eastern Maryland was pro-Confederate. Western Maryland was anti-Confederate for the most part. And Booth, from the beginning really of the war, kind of sees the South in this moonlight magnolia blossom view that he saw. He did not spend a whole lot of time in the South. Being an actor, he was on the road considerably, and he made an immense amount of money. He made as much as $20,000 in that time. Think about what that would be today. So here is the man who sees Abraham Lincoln as the reason for the Civil War, and then at the surrender, he sees Lincoln as the reason for the loss, the Confederate loss in the Civil War. Now, what a lot of people don't realize, I don't think, is that Booth had planned to kidnap Abraham Lincoln earlier in 1865. He gathered together this motley crew, and this set of photographs really shows what a motley looking bunch they were, of men and one woman whose role is somewhat questioned, to try to kidnap the president. There were various plots. I'll go through this a little quickly. One was to throw a bag over him at Ford's Theater. One of the stage hands at Ford's Theater was going to douse the gas lights. They were going to lower Lincoln to the stage, rush him across the same stage Booth, run across in his escape, and out to the alley and take off, take him to the South, where he would be ransomed for Confederate prisoners of war, thus keeping the war going. Well, that didn't work. Then they tried to stop a carriage on the road. Lincoln and Mary Lincoln often rode in the afternoons and carriage ride to relax, and they rode up to the wrong carriage. Well, several of the conspirators at that point said, well, that's enough. We've tried, it didn't work, so we're gonna move on. But let's go through these. David Harold, top left, Lewis Powell, or Payne, two different names, a former Confederate soldier in the middle there, leaning his head back. George Surratt, a painter, wagon painter from Port Tobacco, Maryland, who knew the area that they were going to escape in. Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin in the top and the mustache, Sam Arnold, and then John Surratt at the bottom, and Mary Surratt. Now, Mary Surratt's role is a controversial one. There was even a book and a movie about her about 10 years ago, in which the question is raised, did she really have anything to do with the assassination? Well, she owned a boarding house on H Street in Washington, and her son John lived there. Often Booth and the conspirators met there. Did Mary Surratt know what was going on? I hope that I can tell you as we go through this that I don't think she did that day, though events are going to play into her conviction and eventual hanging as the first woman hanged by the US government in history. And as you alluded to, April 12th, 1865, events begin to speed up. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant's victorious Union armies, and the Civil War, for all intents and purposes, is over, even though there are other Confederate forces still in the field. They would all surrender eventually, very shortly after this. But this is a pinnacle moment. Lee's surrender marks a moment in Booth's life where he feels like the South is gone. The South that he knew is gone. Now, nothing much happens. Washington and much of the United States is in a party mode after Appomattox. The week between Palm Sunday, which is when Lee surrendered, and Good Friday, known as Holy Week, were poor weeks for theater goers because theater owners, because few people went to the theater. Plays were still seen somewhat as questionable activity, perhaps not moral, even though Lincoln really, really enjoyed the theater, gave him a way to get away. But John Wilkes Booth goes to get his mail at Ford's Theater that morning on 10th Street in Washington, D.C., not terribly far from the White House. And there, Booth sees a bustle of activity. And as he reads his mail on one of those front steps there, he says to someone, what's all the hustle and bustle? What's all the activity about? And someone says, didn't you hear? The President and Mrs. Lincoln are coming to the theater tonight. And so is General Grant and his wife. Well, that turned out not to be true. Grant would not go to the theater with Lincoln that night because due to earlier experiences with Mary Lincoln, who had a very volatile personality, Mrs. Grant wanted nothing to do with her. And General Grant made an excuse that they were going to see their children in New Jersey that night. So they would go through a series of invitations, and finally they would have to settle on a young couple, an Army major and his fiancée. We'll talk about it a little bit later. But I think at that point, that's when Booth feels Lincoln's going to be here tonight. I'm going to kill it. There really is no evidence that he had planned to do this before hearing that Lincoln was coming to the theater. So the whole thing starts that morning, the morning of Friday, Good Friday, April 14th, 1865. The play, as it says there, would be Our American Cousin, by all accounts, a fair play, starring English actress Laura Keene, Harry Hawk. Laura Keene was probably the draw. She was a fairly well-known English actress. The president would sit in the private box, which you see in the center there. And it's actually two boxes. If you look closely at the photograph, you can see the partition leaning against the wall that would have divided the two boxes. Now, for the president, they make it one box and bring in a big comfortable rocker and other comfortable furniture, drape it in bunting, portrait of George Washington so that it looks very presidential. Today, when presidents go to Ford's Theater, and they still do, they don't sit in the box. They sit in the audience. This is Ford's Theater, a relatively recent shot, but it shows the shot of the box from the stage. Now, the second level of seating, which we might think of as a balcony, they called the dress circle, and Booth would enter at the door in the back there and then walk down the wall, the far wall that you can see, into the door to the president's box. This is the door. You can see the flags and the bunting on the front of the box, and Booth would enter through that door. There was supposed to be a guard there. We'll talk about what happens later. The interior of the box, president's rocking chair, which is actually, this is a reproduction. The original is in the Ford Museum in Michigan. And Lincoln would sit in the rocker. Mrs. Lincoln on the small wicker seat. And then their guests would sit on the couch and the chair. The guests, as I mentioned, Major Henry Reed Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. And then Mrs. Lincoln would attend as well, obviously. The Lincolns will spend the day, President will spend the day meeting with numerous people throughout the day, including General Grant, the cabinet. Various decisions are made about bringing the draft to a close, stopping enlistments. Things will be changed now. We'll move on toward the Reconstruction period. Lincoln and Mary, Lincoln goes home to the residence in the White House. They have dinner of cold meat and potatoes. They did go on a carriage ride. Lincoln spoke about wanting to see Jerusalem. He said he'd read about it so much in the Bible and he'd always wanted to see it. And Mary warned him that he seemed very happy. Remember, she said, how happy you were just before little Willie died. So there was somewhat of a premonition. Now, did Lincoln have a premonition that he would be assassinated? In all of my reading of the 4 assassinated presidents, all of them seem to feel that it was just a matter of someone having the will to do it. John Kennedy apparently told someone, all somebody has to do is take a high-powered rifle to a tall building and they can kill me. Now, Lincoln had a dream that happened, and we're not exactly sure when this happened, sometime during the war, in which he was riding on a fast-moving craft across the water, and it was taking him, he felt, towards some great thing. Now, some said that may have been the 13th Amendment that ended slavery. Some say it may have been the end of the war, but Lincoln did tell other people that if someone wanted to kill him, they would be able to. Now, also that night, and this is the part that I don't realize, so I don't think a lot of people know about, Booth gathered, late that afternoon, Booth gathered the conspirators together, and he told them that they each had a target that night, each had a job. Now, John Surratt had left the country. He had gone to Canada at the end of the war, felt there was no part, he had no role in this. So he gathered Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Ed Surratt, and he gave each of them an assignment that night. Booth, of course, would take the prize. He would kill Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater as he watched the play. Secretary of State Seward had recently had a carriage accident, had been thrown from the carriage. His jaw was broken, numerous ribs were broken. He was bedridden in his home in Washington. Lewis Powell was to take David Harold as a guide, and Powell would enter the house and kill the Secretary of State. George Ed Surratt was to go to the hotel where Vice President Andrew Johnson lived in Washington, knock on the door, and kill him. Simple as that. They would all then meet in Southern Maryland. They would then be able to get into Virginia, where Booth felt they would be hailed as heroes by the Confederacy, and perhaps the war would start again. Little did he know the reaction that was about to take place. Well, let's start here. Secretary of State Seward, as I said, is bedridden. He is tended by a daughter, some Army nurses, males, his son Frederick, who has been acting almost as Assistant Secretary of State since the accident. And at about 10 o'clock, a knock on the door. Booth stipulated they all strike between 10 and 10:30. So about 10 o'clock, a knock on the door. Now, this is Friday night. It's Good Friday. It's 10 o'clock. Most people in the pre-television, pre-computer days, most people had gone to bed or were thinking about going to bed, especially in what would be called a sick house. The secretary is in very bad shape. He's in bed and people are being quiet so he can rest. Servant answers the door, and Louis Payne, dressed in a duster and a hat, holding a small box, says, "I have medicine from Dr. Verdi for the secretary." Got the doctor right. That was Seward's doctor. Well, the servant said, "I'll take it." Powell pushed past him and headed up the stairs. Now, he didn't know where he was going, but it just so happens that at that point, Seward's daughter opened a door, casting light into the hallway, and Powell believed, well, that must be where he is. He has a large caliber revolver and a large knife. At the top of the stairs, he meets Frederick Seward, who says, well, what are you doing? Well, think again, 10 o'clock at night. What are you doing? What are you doing? He says, I have medicine for the secretary, Dr. Verdi. Fred Seward says, well, give it to me. I'll give it to him. Powell says, no, I have to take it to him myself. Fred says, you can't do that. Powell pulls a pistol, points it directly at Fred Seward's face, and pulls the trigger. Nothing happens. It misfire, as they would do. He hit him with the pistol, beat him savagely about the face and neck with the pistol, dropped the pistol, pulled a large knife, ran into the room where he had seen light from. It was the right room. Secretary of State Seward was on the bed, casts, bandages, just everything around his neck here, and he was helpless. An Army nurse a male tried to stop Powell. Powell stabbed him. He jumped on the bed and began to violently stab Seward. Another male nurse came running in, jumped on him, pulled him off of him. Seward rolled onto the floor against the wall. There was a tussle. That nurse was stabbed. Powell got up, ran from the house. Outside, he screamed, I'm mad. I'm mad. Now, David Harold was waiting outside with their horses. When Harold heard all this yelling and screaming, he took off. So David Harold abandoned Louis Payne, and he would eventually be picked up. He hid in a cemetery. He hid in a tree. He hid outside. He didn't go back until then. Several days later, he returned to Mary Surratt's boarding house, and unlucky for him, there were government detectives there questioning her. And he came in with a shovel and this lame excuse about he was here to dig that ditch for her. And the detective said, "You dig a ditch at 9 o'clock at night?" "I don't think so." "What's your name?" And they told them, and they arrested him and Mrs. Surratt right there. Now, George Surratt had been drinking most of the evening in the bar of President Johnson's hotel, and about 10:15, we're not sure, he went up to the vice president's room, knocked on the door, and left. And he did nothing. He will also be arrested, hiding out in Washington, and he will pay the ultimate price. So Vice President Johnson survived. Now, what will happen to Secretary of State Seward? He survives. He has the wits about him to tell his daughter, close the house, call the police. But he will survive, and he will be the man who will buy Alaska in 1867, known as Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. But it turned out pretty well for the United States. Now back at Ford's Theater. Booth enters the theater. He follows the play a little bit. He sees there is a chair outside the president's box. There is a man, a guard, John Parker, sitting in the chair. But Booth's biding his time. He's waiting for a moment in the play that he knows where there will be a big laugh line. So he leaves the theater. He went to the Star Saloon next door. He was drinking brandy pretty heavily all through the day, accounts say. And as he left the theater, as he left the saloon, a patron turned to him and said, "Aren't you John Booth?" And Booth said, "Well, yes, sir, I am." "Well, you're one hell of an actor, but you're not half the actor your father was." Booth stopped and turned and looked at him and said, "When I leave the stage tonight, I'll be the most famous man in America." And he was right, no doubt. Now, Booth entered the theater again. John Parker has left his seat. The chair sits empty outside the door. Booth makes his way calmly along the wall. He's wearing black hat, black suit, down the dress circle to the door. He enters the box. There's a small hallway outside the box, and the door to the president's box is closed, so Booth stands alone in this hallway. That afternoon, he had gone to the theater and he'd taken a 2x2, most likely a piece of a music stand, and he had propped it so that the door from the dress circle, which opened in, could not be opened from the outside. Propped it against the corner of the wall and the door. And then he stood outside the door to the president's box. Now, there is a small hole drilled in that door, and there is controversy over whether Booth did that afternoon with a knife or whether it had been done before, so when the president visited, people could see into the box without interrupting him. I'm not quite sure. They display the door at the Ford's Theater Museum still to this day. But on stage are Harry Hawk and Laura Keene and another actress. And Harry Hawk's character plays the American cousin, and he has just told the girl Laura Keene and her mother, the actress playing her mother, that he has no wealth. He is not a wealthy man, and that you'll get me just as you see me, my hands empty, just the way they are. Well, the old lady storms off the stage and says, you do not know the polite society, sir," and she storms off the stage. The manners of polite society, and Laura Keene looks at Harry Hawk and bursts into tears and runs off the stage. Alone on the stage, Harry Hawk turns to the audience with what is the big laugh line. And he says, "Don't know the manners of polite society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, you sockdologizing old man trap." At that moment, the audience burst into laughter, and Booth entered the box and shot the president in the back of the head. Lincoln slumped in his chair. Major Rathbone leapt up. Booth had dropped the pistol. It's a one-shot Derringer. And Booth stabbed him viciously about the shoulder. And Booth said in the box, "Sic semper Tyrannis." Now, Harry Hawk was the only actor on stage, and he saw Booth standing there in a cloud of powder smoke, and he heard Booth say, "Sic semper Tyrannis," which means ever thus to tyrants. It's from Shakespeare. It's the motto of the state of Virginia. Booth then leapt the 11 feet to the stage, and he broke the bulb above his ankle on his left leg. Now, he did not hobble across the stage. Eyewitness accounts, and they have to go by the accounts, of course, they all vary, say he strode across the stage, brandishing the dagger, as you can see in the period print here. And he said something to the effect of, "The South shall be free," or "The South is avenged." And he exited through the wings. A stagehand, Peanuts Burroughs, was holding his horse. Booth, painfully, obviously mounted, and he, of course, had been drinking all day, and the adrenaline is flowing, mounts his horse and rides down Baptist Alley, out the back, and out of Washington, D.C. Now, he will cross the Navy Yard Bridge, and this is the first time someone could have stopped him. He rode across the Capitol grounds in moonlight, and he gets to the Navy Yard Bridge, whereas Sergeant Silas Cobb is on guard. Now, Washington, remember, it's a city at wartime, and Washington is not, it's a closed city. You could not come and go freely, especially at night. And the sergeant on duty, Sergeant Cobb, said, "Where are you going?" Booth said, "I'm going to Maryland, meet some friends. Can I cross tonight?" And Sergeant Cobb said he showed no sign of pain. He didn't seem in a hurry. He didn't seem agitated. And Cobb said, "Well, I can let you go, but you can't come back." Now, interestingly here, Booth had rented his horse and Harold's horse, and Lewis Powell's horse is from a stable in Washington. And one of the first people who will give pursuit of Booth is Booth rides by the stable on his way out of the city, and the man owning the stable recognized his horse and mounted up and went after him. So he doesn't know why he's going after him, because he has his horse, not because he's killed the president, shot the president. His first, at the Navy Yard Bridge, he gets across. No sooner does he cross the Navy Yard Bridge, David Harold comes up. It's virtually the same conversation. "Well, you can go across, but you can't come back." And he heads across. And no sooner does he get across than the man from the stable rides up and said, "Did somebody just go by here on a horse looking like such and such?" And poor Sergeant Cobb, who's never seen this much traffic, says, "Well, yeah, he just went across." And the man, Mr. Pumphrey, said, "Well, not worth it, not going to Maryland tonight." So he turned around and went back. So they're in Maryland, and they're on their way. First stop will be Surrattsville, Maryland, the tavern out here, boarding house. You might recognize the name from earlier. I mentioned Mary Surratt and John Surratt. The town was named after Mary Surratt's late husband, and the tavern was then pretty much about the only thing there, a tavern, a few houses. Now, that afternoon, and this is what will really get Mary Surratt in trouble. That afternoon, John Wilkes Booth had gone to her boarding house on H Street. He had a small brown wrapped package, and he said, "I understand that you're going to Surrattsville today." And she was. Mary Surratt was going there to pick up rent money that was owed to her by the man who ran the tavern for him, a John Lloyd. And Booth, now picture this, Booth, the handsomest man, Mary Surratt, a middle-aged widow, and John Wilkes Booth asks you in his finest Southern accent, "Would you be so kind as to take this to Mr. Lloyd at Surrattsville today?" Mary Surratt must have been extremely flattered. So she said, "Why, yes, Mr. Booth, I'll take that." Well, it turned out to be a pair of field glasses. And he said, "Tell Mr. Lloyd to have the things ready for us tonight." Now, during the kidnap plot, they would have followed the route on that red arrow that you see on the map to get Lincoln into Virginia. So Booth had already laid the groundwork for this escape. It just was a matter of telling, so today we pick up our cell phone and call Mr. Lloyd and say, "Get the stuff ready." But then she happened to be going there. Well, there again, it seems to investigators afterwards that Mary Surratt must have been part of this plot. Well, they go to Surrattsville, they get some Army carbines, some whiskey, but now the brandy and the adrenaline are wearing off, and Booth's leg is really hurting him. They ride a little bit further, and Booth says to Harold, "We need to find a doctor. My leg's broken, hurts like the devil. I need to get it treated." Well, Booth knew where a doctor was, all right, because another man that had shown him around Southern Maryland in late 64, 65 was Dr. Samuel Mudd. Now, Booth had told him he was just looking for some land to buy. Well, who would you go to, or someone who knew everywhere and everybody? The doctor. Remember, they still made house calls. The doctor would take his local wagon and would go make house calls all around the counties where he operated. So he knew Booth. They had run into each other in New York City sometime in late 1865, early 64. And Mudd knew Booth. Did he know that this was happening? No, he did not. But they knock on Dr. Mudd's door about 4 o'clock in the morning. And you can imagine this, Saturday morning, the war's just over, somebody pounding on the door, Mudd lets him in. Mudd cuts that boot off of his left leg, and Booth left it behind. Unfortunately, it has his initials in it, which will seal Dr. Mudd's fate. They set it, and Mudd and Harold spent the night. Well, early that morning, Dr. Mudd rode into Bryantown nearby and saw that there were soldiers in town. And he asked them, "What's going on?" Again, no TV, no internet. He didn't turn on this Saturday morning news before he headed into Bryantown. And someone says, "Well, haven't you heard? They shot the president in Washington last night." Now, Lincoln, I should say, has been carried across the street. Lincoln, in all books about the assassination, seems to be the minor character here. It's all about the assassins and the people out there. Lincoln has been carried across the street to the Peterson boarding house. Talk about that a little bit here, but he will spend a very uncomfortable night. He will be unconscious, will never regain consciousness, a constant parade of people coming to see him. But the next morning, after Dr. Mudd went to Bryantown and learned that the president had been shot, he immediately knows why Booth is there. And he goes back to his home. Booth and Harold are mounted. They're in the yard. And Dr. Mudd says, "You have no idea the trouble you've caused me. You must leave immediately." And they do. They will continue further south into Maryland. But Mudd will be arrested. The boot will be found, and he will be charged with as an accessory after the fact. Well, the Peterson boarding house, the wait has gone on. It's now about 7:22 a.m. It's raining. It was raining too, by the way, when Booth and Harold arrived at Dr. Mudd's house. And there weren't nearly enough room in that room. The room is a photograph on the left, and the 19th century print on the right. You could see it like the entire cabinet and congressmen and everybody else are in there. But you can see there wasn't the room. Mary Lincoln was in and out. Secretary of War Stanton, who, it's amazing, he wasn't targeted as well, because Stanton will lead the investigation that will track down Booth and all the conspirators. But Stanton will run the government, will send out orders, will actually from that front room at the Peterson boarding house, will send out orders to hunt for John Wilkes Booth, interview people right there in the front room, the actors from Ford's Theater, people, eyewitnesses, and the hunt for Booth goes out. And a wanted poster will be printed with photographs on it. From what I understand, it's the first wanted poster with photographs in U.S. history that will go out and a large reward is offered. But as morning, the sun comes up, rain outside, Mrs. Lincoln is taken out of the room. Robert Lincoln has come from the White House. He had just returned from the Army that previous day, and an officer on General Grant's staff. And he said he just wanted to sleep in a real bed. That's why he declined to go to the theater. He was invited by his parents. And various dignitaries do come and go. An Army doctor, Charles Leal, who was in civilian clothes that night, one of the first ones to reach the president, held his hand throughout much of the night. And Leal said later he wanted him to know someone was there. But at 7:22 a.m., that morning, President Lincoln stopped breathing for the last time. Secretary of War Stanton is thought to have said, "It's too good a story not to tell. Now he belongs to the ages." And the 16th president of the United States was dead. Well, our assassins continue their flight south. And things don't go nearly as well, I think, as Booth expected. Samuel Cox is home. They reluctantly give him some help. He is in pain. He is not shaved. They give him some food. And then Cox takes him to a pine thicket, he and David Harold, and their horses to a pine thicket. From April 16th to April 21st, they will hide outside in a pine thicket in the woods. They heard the sound of cavalry patrols, Union cavalry, now going out after them, going down the roads around them. Booth spends his day writing in his diary. It's actually an appointment book. He writes that he's hunted like Cox had brought them newspapers, so they know that they're not popular and they're being hunted. And the North and South, widely, he is derided as a villain. And Booth says, "I'm hunted like a dog. No one understands what I did for my country." Well, Cox comes to see them on the 21st. He says, "Well, there's a boat. We'll take it and get across the river into Virginia." Well, Harold and Booth get into this boat with a compass and one candle, and they start to row across the Potomac. And if you've ever been to this part of Virginia and Maryland, you know the Potomac's quite wide. It's really, really wide. And they went to out into the river and eventually turned around, did not know they turned around, and came back to the Maryland side. The next night they tried again. They bumped into an Army ironclad warship, a Union ironclad warship that was in the river, and they just sort of let the boat drift away. But eventually they landed in Maryland and will head to the south. Now, they will go, they're still riding the horses. Horses are just about shot. And they get to the home of a free black man named Lucas. And Booth told Harold, "We're sleeping inside. I'm not sleeping outside again." So they go to Lucas's door, Harold does, and he says, "Man out here on a horse gonna sleep in your house tonight." And Lucas protests, but Harold at gunpoint said, "You get out of the house." So Lucas and his wife and children will spend the night in the yard. And I don't think they slept much under a tree while Booth and Harold slept in the house. They left the next morning, headed for the Rappahannock River, which you can see here on the map. The Rappahannock is also a fairly wide river and was crossed by a ferry. Now, at the ferry, they met 3 Confederate soldiers who were on their way home. One, the most important one here, is named Willie Jett. And they say, "Where our horses are shot, can we ride with you? Will you take us on to Bowling Green," which is between the Rappahannock, just beyond what you see the X where it says Garrett Farm. And they say, "Well, that's where we're going. We'll take you. You can ride along with us." So Harold and Booth ride piggyback with 2 of the soldiers. The third one rides along. And during this ride, Booth can't contain himself. he tells Willie Jett what he's done. I'm the man who killed the president. Well, Jett tries to play it cool here. It's like, well, that's something, all right. Yeah. Well, now Jett wants to get rid of these guys. So they take him to the GARRETT farm, which is outside of Bowling Green, Virginia, near Fredericksburg. And Mr. Garrett's not 100% excited to see these guys either, but okay, Southern hospitality is a real thing. We'll put you up, give you some food, but we'd like you to move on as soon as you can. Very, very well, we will. Well, Jett and his companions continue on just further south here to Bowling Green, and there was a boarding house there where Jett knew a girl. Well, the Army Cavalry Patrol, 16th New York Cavalry, rode up that night, the night of April 25th, 26th, and said, do you know the whereabouts of a man named John Wilkes Booth? And with a gun to his head, Jett said, I know right where he is, as I think we all would. He said, he's at Garrett's farm. It's back the road toward the river. I could show you. So they quit, get dressed, and they bundle him off. Now you've got a company of the 16th New York Cavalry under Lieutenant Doherty, and there's two civilian detectives riding along with him. And they will head back toward the GARRETT farm. Well, the night of April 25th, Booth and Harold were talking in the yard, and Mr. Garrett said, you can't sleep in the house tonight. You can sleep in the barn. And Booth took that as an affront. That's not civil, that's not manners, that's not Southern hospitality. And Garrett said, I don't care, you can sleep in the barn. So they put them in a tobacco barn. A tobacco barn is interesting because it has slats in the boards allowing the tobacco to dry. So there were gaps in the wood. And then Mr. Garrett told his two sons, you sleep in the corn crib and watch that barn. Because he was afraid they were going to steal horses. Because remember, now the two have no horses. I failed to mention earlier that Harold had killed the two horses in that pine thicket, fearing that their whinnying and their neighing would be heard by the cavalry patrols. Forgive me for that, leaving that out. But here they are in the barn on April 26th, before dawn, before sunlight, when a cavalry patrol rides up. 16th New York Cavalry, and in the somewhat dramatic 19th century print, you see, they surrounded the barn, and you've seen this portrayed before. They called into him, come out, we know it's you might as well surrender, there's no way out. And Booth very bravely said, no, I will not surrender, what are your terms? And David Harold finally cracked. Harold said, I can't take this anymore, I want to go out. Well, soldiers could hear the two of them arguing somewhat. And Booth then yelled out, I have a man in here who wants to surrender. So they told him, have him stick his hands out of the door. So they opened the door, which the Garrett brothers had locked the night before. They opened the door, poor Davy Harold stuck his arms out. They grabbed him, dragged him to a nearby locust tree, tied him to it, put a bag over his head. And then they yelled to Booth, come out, we have your friend. Booth said, I will not come out, not without talking to your terms. What are your terms? Well, someone decided it was time to force the issue. Kindling hay were set by the side of the barn, and the barn will begin to take fire. Force him out, smoke him out. Well, they yelled out, come out, Booth. There's no hope for you now. And Booth shouted out, prepare a stretcher for me, boys. To the side of the barn, an Army sergeant named Boston Corbett could see that Booth was fumbling with one of the Spencer carbines. And Boston Corbett shot him through the cracks in the barn, striking him in the neck. Booth dropped. They rushed in and they dragged him out. They dragged him onto the porch of the GARRETT farm, seen here in the photograph. Sergeant Corbett, the man who had done it, and Lieutenant Doherty, 16th New York, was in command. And Booth had a quite uncomfortable death. He did not go quickly. The sun was just beginning to come up, and because he's now paralyzed from the shot in the neck, he can't talk really well. His throat fills with blood. He can't walk or move, obviously, so he will mutter to them to roll him on his side, and they will roll him on his side, and the blood will run out of his mouth, and he'll become uncomfortable in that position, and they rolled him back to his back, and so on and so forth for a good long time, an hour or more. When finally, with the sun coming up and actually beginning to get in his eyes to the point where he asked that something be done, so they draped a blanket over the back of a chair so that it caused shade for his head, and Booth asked to see his hands. And as one of the detectives bent over him, Booth said, "Tell my mother I'd die for my country." And then he said, "My hands, I want to see my hands." And the detective held the hands up in front of Booth's face, and Booth said, "Useless, useless," and died. Well, Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, George Ed Surratt, David Harold were all arrested and tried. And if you note the date, look how fast this trial was. The trial was a military trial. It took place very quickly. And here on July 7th, 1865, in the grounds of the old Capitol Prison, the 4 conspirators were hanged. It said Mary Surratt is the first woman in U.S. legal history hanged by the U.S. Government. But vengeance was swift. Now, as for the other conspirators, O'Laughlin, Arnold, and Mudd were sentenced to life at hard labor in dry Tortugas off the Florida Keys, and they don't call it dry Tortugas for nothing. There's no water there. There was an army fort there, it became a prison, and Dr. Mudd will be pardoned 2 years later for helping with a yellow fever epidemic in which Michael O'Laughlin and numerous other prisoners died. And so Dr. Mudd was pardoned. His wife had been petitioning for a pardon for quite some time. So Mudd is pardoned, but of course, we have the phrase, "Your name is Mudd," which may or may not be in relation to Dr. Mudd. Now, there are many coincidences between, especially President Kennedy and President Lincoln assassination. Just a few. I don't want to go into them. I think that they are nothing more than coincidences, but both were shot on a Friday. Both of their wives were at their side. Both were shot in the head. Both were shot by a Southerner. Okay, obviously those coincidences work. If you look on the internet and find a lot of other coincidences, some of them start to get very deep and very questionable. There's one which I've been able to disprove, and I'm sure I'm not the first one to do it, is that Abraham Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy, and Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. Well, Kennedy's secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, is a pretty well-known figure. I can't find a Kennedy secretary for Abraham Lincoln. His 2 secretaries through his entire presidency were John Hay and John Nicolay. No Kennedys there. Coincidences between the other 2, James Garfield in the lower left, William McKinley in the upper right, not really, except for the fact that they had all said, "Someone wants me, they'll get me." Now, if anyone would like to read a little further, I have listed 3 books here, which I have found to be the most useful in my research on the assassination, though there are dozens of books about alleged conspiracies around the Lincoln assassination, and as well as the Kennedy assassination. But the 3 books that I feel are the most straightforward and do the best to blow away, if you will, those conspiracies. The day Lincoln was shot by Jim Bishop is an early one, 1955. He also wrote The Day Kennedy Was Shot. And it's a straightforward, this is what we know, this is how it happened. American Brutus by Michael Kaufman is a fantastic book, which goes into the chase, It goes into all the conspiracies, and Kaufman very clearly, very concisely makes the point that it was Booth, and Booth did it. And it was Booth that they got in the barn, and it was Booth that they buried. Manhunt by James Swanson is also very well done, though I think, in my opinion, Kaufman's book is a little better. So if someone's looking to read a little more, those are available at your public library. And one thing I'd like to point out is that if you visit the Hagen History Center, you may be able to see, though we recently took it off exhibit for to allow it to rest, the flag that draped President Lincoln's casket when he lay in state in Albany, New York. Now, the governor of New York had the flag, gave it to an assistant, who gave it to a daughter, who ended up living in Erie, who donated to the Historical Society some time ago. But that flag is about as close as you'll get to Abraham Lincoln in Erie. He came through, the funeral train came through on its way back to Springfield, but did not stop. Lincoln made a brief stop here in 1861 on his way to Washington, on his way for his inaugural, made a brief speech. Of course, famously, he stopped in Westfield, New York, where he met Grace Bedell, little girl who had written him a letter suggesting that he grow a beard so it would make him look better, as her brothers and father had recently grown beards. But that brings to an end my talk about the Kennedy assassination, or excuse me, the Lincoln assassination. Angela?
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you for this excellent, with a lot of pictures, and you really summarize it so well about what happened after the assassination. And thank you for mentioning the connection here with Erie. I'll make sure I'll visit the Hagen History Center as soon as I can. We have a few minutes left for a few questions that I would like to ask you, if you don't mind. So you mentioned Lincoln's bodyguard. If I compare to today's public appearances of presidents, usually they're heavily shielded with vetted security personnel. Lincoln's bodyguard, John Frederick Parker, you mentioned him, was not on his post. He did not watch the door to the presidential box. So I have actually two questions here. Why wasn't Lincoln better guarded? And could there perhaps been somebody who would have or could have profited from Lincoln's death?
I don't know who would have profited from Lincoln's death, but as far as Parker goes, he was a Washington Metropolitan Police officer who had a very checkered record, and he left his post, and there are those accounts that say he was actually in the same saloon where Booth was, next to the theater at some point. Nothing was ever done to Parker. Presidents were not protected the way we think of presidents being protected, even as far back as John Kennedy. The Secret Service was created by Lincoln, very close proximity to the assassination, but it was not created to protect presidents or public officials. It was created as part of the Treasury Department to hunt counterfeiters, which is what the Secret Service still does today in their field offices, is track down counterfeiting. But presidents were not well protected. James Garfield had no protection with him when he was shot in a Washington, D.C. train station. Now, Robert Lincoln, I mentioned James Garfield. Robert Lincoln was James Garfield's Secretary of War, and he had gone to the train station with him. And Robert Lincoln was also in the cabinet of William McKinley in 1901, and Robert Lincoln was nearby when McKinley was assassinated. And after that, Robert Lincoln said he would be nowhere near a president of the United States. He was bad luck, he thought. But no, we see this, as you said, a bevy of vetted security people, people who go to the rallies and things are passed through metal detectors, and they're not. It's not a free and open right. You could walk into the White House, even as late as when James Garfield was president. You could simply walk into the White House, wait in the hall, and hope to, thrust a request for a bill or something in his face, or hand him a letter, or ask for an autograph if you saw the president. It was not uncommon. American presidents didn't feel, they felt that it made them unattainable, untouchable. They didn't want to be protected, but they didn't think about this bevy of protection the way we have around presidents today. Even John Kennedy, with all the Secret Service agents that were around him, as we look back and think what a waste that was, and what a poor effort they made. No, the Secret Service agents around John Kennedy did everything they could. So I guess the case is, if you wanted to get a president, then it can happen. It can happen. I think that's a lesson that we all have to learn. I know that the Secret Service today teaches about these assassinations and the lessons that they can learn from them.
Yeah, quite astonishing from today's point of view. I have one more question, and then we have reached the end of the program. I'm a family person myself, and I can only feel or speculate how much such a violent assassination and turmoil affected the Lincoln family. So what happened to them after the assassination? What happened to Mary, Robert, and Ted?
Well, I mentioned what happened to Robert. He led a successful public career and became a quite wealthy man in his own right. Ted was attending a play himself that night. He was attending a play, Aladdin's Lamp, at Grover's Theater. And they whisked him back to the White House when word reached the theater that the president had been shot at Ford's Theater. And Ted did not live past 12 years old. He died of disease before he reached 12. And Mary Lincoln went into what eventually lifelong depression and sadness. And she lived with her married sister for the rest of her life. Made no public appearances, and it sent the entire family into turmoil, as you can imagine. They had already lost son Eddie and the son Willie. Eddie before the Civil War, Willie during the Civil War, to typhoid fever for Willie, and they were both Abraham and Mary Lincoln were on. Probably today we would refer to them as being depressed, and one can understand. One can understand. Mary Lincoln especially had fits of depression and anger and withdrawal. And the president at one point is said to have taken her to a window in the White House and pointed to a building on the adjacent hill in Alexandria, Virginia, that was an insane asylum, and said, "Mother, we'll both go there if you don't stop this." And she seemed to come around, but was never really a happy woman.
I can imagine. All right, so thank you again for taking the time today to join us for this Jefferson program. Jeff, this was fabulous. I can't wait for another program with you. Unfortunately, there are other assassinations we can look into, but they're interesting because they also are a reflection of the time, of the turbulency of a specific time. And
the last thing I would say, Angela, and I know you want to get going, the last thing I would say is that the question is always asked, what would have Lincoln become had he not been assassinated?
yes.
How would the history of the United States been different? And I don't like to speculate on that. I do think Reconstruction would have been different, but would that period have tarnished the president's reputation? Hard to tell.
Yeah, he died too early because it was
Yes,
so close to the end of the Civil War, and America needed him for longer, but that was also the reason why he was assassinated, because of that time. So
That's right.
I agree, yes, but that is probably another talk we need to have, the politics after the assassination. Would be very interesting. You are very welcome to come back to the Jefferson for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff, for folks who are looking to connect with you, where can we point them?
I can be reached at the Hagen History Center. Our number is 454-1813, and I'm extension 33. Or you can contact me by email by going to the Hagen History Center website, www.eriehistory.org.
Thank you. And to all of you watching at home, thank you also for tuning in. And to find out more about both upcoming and past Jefferson programs, as well as publications, head over to our website at www.jeserie.org. And be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Angela Beaumont. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for learning with us.